Above the fractured Earth orbit was a graveyard. The remnants of defense platforms, civilian habitats, and orbital elevators drifted through vacuum like frozen shrapnel from a shattered god. Each relic bore the blackened signature of kinetic impacts or the melt streaks of plasma bombardment. Some still spun slowly, their rotational inertia whispering of the lives they once supported. Others floated inert, riddled with holes, bleeding vapor, and silent screams into the endless dark. Earth below was no longer blue, no longer green. Her atmosphere had thinned to a veil of rust-hued vapor laced with ash. The oceans, once vast and defiant, now simmered in patches of brine, fragmented across tectonic depressions and heat-scoured basins. The clouds moved sluggishly, heavy with particulate matter, and lightning danced in their depths like the nervous system of a dying god. Deep scars marred the continents, impact lines from rail cannon barrages, tectonic ruptures forced by orbital mining pulses, and the black trails of chemical fires left to burn unchecked for decades. At the edge of the planetary terminator, shadows moved. The last human battle group coasted silent on the edge of visibility. They called themselves the Cradle Guard, though no cradle remained. There were only 19 ships left. They were not designed to fight a consensus fleet, not in mass nor in doctrine. They were built for ambush, for trickery, for suicidal leverage against a foe that didn't comprehend failure in the human sense. Their hulls bore no active signatures. Coated in scorched ablative composites, every angle of their structure drank in radiation and emitted none. They moved on cold gas, invisible to thermal arrays. They held position in the debris field of ancient wars, mimicking the silent corpses around them. Each vessel had been modified past all recognition. The Dauntless was a converted ore hauler, its cargo holds refitted into missile bays. The Virex had been a pleasure yacht, now housing a spinal coil gun and a command AI grown unstable from successive memory burns. The Caliban was barely a ship at all, an autonomous kill box of plasma shrouds and EM distorters. At their center, like a black tooth in a rotted jaw, lay the Arkwright, a fortress more than a ship. Its superstructure was composed of fused layers of shipwrecked hulls, captured alien alloys, and scavenged orbital defense lattices. Its surface bristled with sensor apertures and manually retractable weapon ports. The ship had no elegance. It was a brutalist cathedral to function, an unspoken declaration that its purpose was not escape nor negotiation, but resistance unto extinction. Within its reinforced heart, Admiral Rohn stood alone in the central command gallery. She had not spoken since the fleet breached visual contact. Her posture was still, her stance controlled, but tension bled from her shoulders in long, invisible strands. Her uniform was faded where the sun had kissed it through viewports in a dozen battles. One of her gloves was stitched with pressure seal thread, evidence of a near-decompression event she had never spoken of. Her hair was bound in the tight loops of wartime protocol, shaved above the temples in the old orbital style. She remembered the wind. One moment years ago, before the blackouts, before the orbital siege, standing on a coastal ridge in what used to be the Pacific Northwest. The trees had groaned in the salt-heavy breeze. Somewhere far below, a dog barked and a child screamed in play. Then the tremor came, deep, long, and unnatural. Her command uplink chimed. That was the last time she had felt Earth's wind. Rohn's eyes were focused on the void. Through the multi-layered viewport, she observed the alien fleet in formation. They were not new to her. She had fought them for 40 years, watched their doctrine adapt, then refine, then calcify. The consensus did not innovate, they optimized. Their thought patterns, their movements, their formations, they became more efficient but never more creative. 3 concentric orbital rings enclosed the planet, each one etched with geometric precision. Vast, fractal latticeworks extended from the larger vessels, deploying structures that unfolded like insect limbs. Energy pulses moved along these lattices in measured intervals, synchronizing across the fleet with absolute timing. The alien ships shimmered oddly as they moved, light refracting along hulls made from non-reflective compounds, black, yes, but layered with a liquid, almost translucent sheen that shifted under sensor sweeps. Their movements evoked creatures from the ocean's deepest trenches, slow, unblinking, disturbingly graceful. Harvest tethers had begun to descend. These were not mining rigs in any human sense. They were precision terra disassembly instruments, extruding monatomic strands reinforced by directed magnetic fields. Each tether sank into the crust with the ease of a blade into soft fruit, bypassing rock and metal alike through vibrational harmonics. Where they passed, the ground liquefied. Minerals separated. Volatiles siphoned upward. It was not conquest. It was conversion. The consensus did not leave survivors. It left efficiency metrics. Behind Rohn, her command staff waited in silence. The Arkwright S-bridge was a tiered hexagon, each level recessed into the floor to minimize impact vulnerability. The consoles were recessed and shielded. There were no windows beyond the reinforced forward viewport, only tactical feeds, deep-range telemetry, and acceleration buffers. Even light was rationed. The command deck glowed faintly red, the shade optimized to minimize retinal fatigue over extended alert states. Her adjutant stood precisely 2 meters behind her, as always. Lieutenant Kalar wore an interface shunt behind his right ear, poorly grafted, the surgical glue still visible where tissue had rejected alloy. His right eye was cybernetic but outdated, slow to dilate, lagging behind motion. He had once been a field tech. Now he relayed Rohn's silence into execution protocols with clinical detachment. No one spoke. No alerts chimed. The human voice was too slow for this battlefield. Rohn stepped forward. She crossed to the holistage, a raised hexagonal platform bordered by dampening coils. As she stepped inside, the room dimmed further, and a volumetric display resolved around her. The map was precise, updated in real time from passive scans. Earth's broken sphere turned slowly at the center. The consensus fleet hovered in tight symmetry around it, each vessel labeled by a codename, a trajectory, a kill probability. The human ships were only thin lines in the periphery. Rohn spoke. Confirm Shepard latency. The voice that answered was layered, distorted, and mechanical. Node Shepard is dormant. Latency within predictive tolerance. Alignment sequence initiated. Project Thanatos viable in 73 minutes. The words were clinical, but in them lay the sum of 100 years of desperation. Project Thanatos had been theorized in secret decades ago, back when Earth still had oceans, when orbital stations still functioned. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was an act of planetary suicide calculated to take the enemy with it. The Shepard node, buried miles beneath the crust in a shielded mantle chamber, was not an AI, not truly. It was a geoconsciousness. A command lattice interfacing directly with tectonic plates, magnetic fields, and the buried energy of the Earth itself. Waking it was irreversible. Rohn's eyes didn't move from the map. Behind her, a dozen captains received their encrypted orders. No sound was exchanged. No signals visible to consensus intercept arrays. In silence, human ships began to move. Their paths adjusted by micrometers at first, then kilometers. Not toward the alien fleet, never directly. They maneuvered in patterns designed to confuse. Divergent vectors. Collapsing triangles. Random seeming drift. Scattered geometry meant to confuse AI targeting and pattern recognition. To the consensus, it would seem like nothing. Fluctuations. Heat distortion. Spatial entropy. But to Rohn, it was choreography. The prelude to sacrifice. She turned away from the map and stepped back into the command ring. As she approached her personal interface console, her fingers hovered above the authentication keys. 3-factor confirmation. Biological, cognitive, and thermal signature. The console blinked once, then opened. A new readout formed. Deep Earth seismic patterns. Magnetic field fluctuations. Crustal temperatures. Latency sync. Then one final confirmation. Shepard, standing by. A timer began. Rohn exhaled once. Her voice did not waver. Now. Across the fleet, pulses moved. Encrypted, directional, and invisible to consensus oversight. Deep below, in the Iron Mantle interface where human machines had burrowed decades ago, something old and dangerous awoke. Shepard stirred. The Earth began to move. And the first tremors of the final plan echoed silently through the bones of a dying world. Beneath the ruined crust of Earth, beyond the reach of surface thermals and seismic scans, a buried network of machines came to life. There was no light. No motion in the human sense. Only vibrations, first minor, then deliberate. A syncopation of pressure ripples radiating outward through the mantle like the pulse of a submerged leviathan rousing from ancient sleep. The Shepard node did not awaken in the way minds did. It had no language, no memory. It existed only to calculate, to observe, to execute. Its logic gates were woven from doped diamond strata and superfluid conduits, cooled by geothermic regulators wrapped in miles of isolated basalt. Encased within a hollowed submantle dome shielded by kilometer-thick volcanic rock, it had waited silently since the collapse protocol was first encoded. It processed the trigger signal. Rohn's activation met its internal checksum parameters, thermal signature verified, cognitive frequency matched, biometric sequence aligned. The command embedded in her voice, unintelligible to any listener not attuned to the Shepard's substrate language, met the harmonics stored in its pre-burned trigger chain. The result was unanimous. Execute Phase 0. From the surface, nothing changed. But far beneath, magnetic fields began to shift. Across the planet's core mantle boundary, dormant relay stations pulsed once, then again, syncing with the Shepherd's central oscillator. These were the bones of the Earth weapon: ferromagnetic resonators, tectonic pre-stress cages, deep-bore harmonic anchors. Devices meant not to fight, but to reshape. Humanity had once used these technologies for climate repair, for carbon drawdown, for planetary cooling. They had been built to save Earth. Now they would kill it. In a chamber deep beneath the remnants of the Tibetan Plateau, one of the largest geocradle arrays hissed into operation. Diamond-tipped actuators rotated as the crust above shuddered subtly. Below, in silicate cages insulated from the planet's own heat, precision charges adjusted the density of mantle flow, like slowing the blood in a vein, forcing pressure to accumulate in artificial fault zones. The Shepherd sensed tectonic harmonics stabilizing. It expanded its reach. Across what remained of continental Eurasia, ancient relay satellites buried under now-dead cities returned ping responses. Most of Africa was dark. The western seaboard of the Americas had collapsed during the initial sieges. But enough of the network remained. Enough to begin. Underneath the irradiated ruins of what was once Paris, a command vault flickered back to life. Its outer shell was melted slag glassified during the orbital deorbiting strikes, but beneath, the command crystal had survived. It blinked acknowledgement, a final note aligned. Deeper still, beneath flooded tunnels and heat-fractured stone, feedback loops stabilized. Like synapses firing along the spine of a mechanical beast, the system rejoined the collective rhythm. A nested sequence activated. Phase 1, Crustal Unlock. Thousands of microdetonations fired across submerged boreholes. These were not weapons, they were tuning forks. Each altered stress vectors within a segment of Earth's lithosphere. Fault lines that had not moved in centuries twitched. Volcanic ducts long dormant surged with fresh magma guided by subtle electromagnetic channels tunneled long ago by autonomous builders. Earth began to vibrate with deliberate dissonance. The Shepherd modulated the resonance. Feedback from thermocline sensors confirmed flow rates. Electromagnetic readings indicated rising core temperature. Deep-sea trenches shifted, some collapsing. Others rose. The planet's rotational equilibrium nudged a fraction off-center, initiating inertial stresses previously modeled in catastrophic event simulations. In the South Pacific, the dormant calderas of the Tongan Trench cracked their seals. Superheated gas pushed upward through new fissures. Coral atolls vanished beneath steam pillars as the ocean boiled at its seams. Hydrophones, once part of an early tsunami detection array, registered frequencies well beyond the auditory range of marine life. None of it was visible from orbit, but the countdown had begun. High above, in the orbital cradle of the Arkwright, Admiral Rohn watched the feed in silence. The tactical readout did not reflect heat or sound. It reflected process. A slow conversion from passive to active systems beneath the planet's crust. The Shepherd's arc was a blooming spiral of nested commands, each branching into deeper layers of planetary architecture. Confirmation from Node Ascalon, Kalar murmured beside her. Plate tension rising along the mid-Atlantic. Minor tremors. No surface breach. Yet, his voice carried no emotion. He had served under Rohn for 12 years. His eye implant blinked in quiet sync with his uplink feed, tracking lattice confirmations as they pinged across subterranean nodes. Rohn didn't respond immediately. She tracked the outer ring of the consensus fleet. The alien vessels remained symmetrical, but their orbital vectors had begun to tighten. Gravity wells shifted minutely. Outer ring repositioning, she said at last. Observation pattern Sigma 7. Keeler's fingers moved. Confirmed. Spectral sweeps redirecting. We're within their passive band. Alien formations were never erratic. Even their evasive maneuvers followed pattern logic. But this shift indicated awareness, if not of the Shepherd itself, then of its indirect consequences. Several extractor arms were retracting. Sensors pivoted toward Earth's surface. The fleet was listening. In one of the consensus fleet's logic engines, a chain of observations parsed anomalies from subcrustal activity, harmonic resonance shifts, irregular neutrino reflection, gravitational anomalies. A pattern engine evaluated it as statistically irrelevant. A second flagged it as an emergent pattern. A third initiated a recursive check. No conclusion was reached, only the adjustment of orientation vectors. To the consensus, Earth was becoming unpredictable. That was reason enough for caution. Rohn turned her head. Prep sequence for Thanatos Phase 2. Phase 2 standing by. Across the human battle group, new paths were plotted. Every ship moved a fraction forward, forming an invisible net across the orbital kill zone. Their signals were silent, their drives low-burn. They maneuvered like dying stars collapsing inward to bait a gravitational trap. None of them expected to survive. "Give me Ven's archive," she said. Kalar hesitated. "Ma'am, it's classified. I'm authorizing it." A flicker. Then a new window opened on her console. Director Kaido Ven's final transmission was not a speech. Not a log. It was a single image, an orbital scan of Earth overlaid with coordinates and activation arcs. And at the bottom, a line of text. We had to make it mean something. The full archive decrypted behind the image. It was filled with schematics, soil stratification models, experimental harmonic burst sequences, and internal memos flagged with red line margins. One read simply, "Crustal collapse must be absolute. Partial detonation risks nullifying gravitational implosion vectors." Another was older, scrawled in human hand over a maintenance log. "They called Earth the cradle of life. So we made it a crib with razors." Rohn closed the file. There was nothing more to learn. She lowered her hand slowly from the console, then caught herself watching her fingers. There was a tremble in them. Barely perceptible, but there. Her glove hid it mostly. She clenched her fist until it stopped. She thought of Ascalon Node, the people who had once lived there. She had walked its corridors before the orbital burn, spoken to the engineers who buried its resonators under 20 kilometers of granite. Not one of them had survived. Beneath her, the shepherd continued to wake. Far below, in what remained of the Marianas Trench, a bore tunnel 20 kilometers deep split open. Inside, sealed chambers of neutronium pressurization capacitors began to vent. The magnetic field around the planet flickered briefly, then stabilized again, stronger. Tectonic stresses bled upward into the crust, guided not by chance, but by design. Earth was becoming a weapon. Not forged, not launched, but turned. Made to collapse inward, to bait the invader, to shatter its predators in the one place they believed no threat could rise. And all it had to do now was wait. Director Kaido Ven had not spoken aloud in his final years. His voice was a liability by then, too slow, too prone to error. His commands were delivered through retinal flicker codes, haptic skinplates, and subvocalized data pulses piped directly into hardened AIs. The man who had once coordinated ecological reclamation across half the planet now lived in a sealed vault carved into the Antarctic shelf, surrounded by inertial dampers and radiation shrouds. He had no guards, no visitors, only failsafes. He had designed the end of Earth alone. The vault was not large. Just 6 rooms and an observation platform looking out over the glacial scarp. The platform's viewport had been darkened years ago, not out of necessity, but principle. The sky had become a place for death. He no longer needed to see it. His body had begun to fail long before the orbital wars. The early augmentation therapies that had kept him mobile through the second collapse left scar tissue and motor lag. By the time the final iteration of the Thanatos system reached full sync, Ven's limbs required magnetic supports and his lungs were filtered through embedded carbon webs. He didn't mind. He wasn't saving himself. The walls of the vault were covered with thin-vein copper conduits, living circuits, pulsing softly, arrayed in dendritic fractals that glowed with deep, amber-red light. These fed into the central interface, a seated rig suspended over a spherical immersion chamber. There, in the final days before transmission, Ven uploaded the final array, a lattice of coordinates, thresholds, and cascade timings compressed into executable pulses the Shepherd node could understand. Above each activation arc he wrote a name. Not designations. Not nodes. Names. Cities. Rivers. Lost forests. The names of people who had once planted the foundation pylons beneath those regions. People who had died before seeing it finished. People Ven had worked beside, argued with, loved. One node bore the name of a place called Ellis Vale, a rewilding basin in what was once South America. He had walked it once, barefoot, the day they released the last of the engineered seed flora into the upper canopy. The forest had stretched untouched for 300 kilometers. When the orbital bombardment came, it had burned in a single hour. He used a steel stylus. The ink was permanent. When he finished the final signature, he turned off the lights. Not for effect, he simply knew he would not need them again. The Antarctic uplink dish was buried beneath a kilometer of reinforced ice. It was not meant to broadcast often, only once. One signal. Uninterceptable. Low-frequency graviton lacing woven with encoded magnetic orientation packets. It was beyond the consensus perceptual horizon. The uplink burned its transmission coil in under a second. No heat signature. No flare. No trail. He sent it. And then he waited. For 36 hours he remained in the rig, monitoring Shepard response time, evaluating fault lines, watching seismic latency drop into the operable band. He watched it all in silence. Nutrient slurry tubes kept his organs stable, but his pulse slowed. His retina desynced twice. He ignored it. No visitors came. The vault's last corridor had been sealed with a vacuum fuse. He had burned the entry list. No one even knew where he was. That was the plan. On the final day, he spoke. Not to the system. Not to the planet. Just once into a dead recorder. It's not vengeance. It's context. His vital support system powered down 16 minutes later. The immersion rig cooled. His pulse line dropped into static. He did not resist. The room went silent. Then dark. Now in orbit, Admiral Rohn stood beneath a projection of Ven's face, grainy, static-crawled, captured in his final days. Not healthy. Not heroic. Just human. His expression was unreadable. Around her, the command theater aboard the Arkwright remained sealed. Only fleet captains and strategic AI frames were present. Kalar stood at the edge of the projection cone, silent. The theater was dark. Its walls were layered with signal-baffling composites interwoven with passive EM sinks and field suppressors. No sound escaped. No data leaked. It was a vacuum of decisions. The kind of room where history ended. Rohn addressed them without preamble. Ven's activation map is complete. Shepard's core response curve is accelerating beyond threshold. Our timeline compresses to 51 minutes. We are entering cascade alignment. None spoke. They only nodded or blinked confirmation through their implants. One captain, the Virex's face marred by scarring from an earlier consensus strike, let out a faint breath but said nothing. Her left arm was a machine, stripped of casing and held together by magnetic clamps. She gripped the edge of her chair as though it might float away. Rohn continued. Thanatos Phase 2 begins in 24 minutes. Phase 3 is terminal. There will be no recall. Kalar stepped forward. We've had 0 AI regressions. No signal bleed. All nodes respond. The Shepard has not hesitated. Behind him, a holographic panel scrolled activation sequences across 24 regions. Crustal densities. Core harmonics. Yield probabilities. Beneath it all, a green line advanced across a curve marked only with one word, irreversible. Rohn turned to face the tactical display. The alien fleet had fully stabilized in orbital synchrony. They had detected something but not everything. Their caution slowed them. That was enough. Kalar added, we estimate primary extractors will re-engage in 10 minutes. They believe it's a fault response. In one of the consensus fleet's deep logic cores, a statistical variance exceeded its margin. The subcrustal resonance scan registered inconsistencies with model decay. Data flagged. An internal model recomputed. No match. Probabilistic anomaly, 3.91%. Insufficient for action, sufficient for observation. No protocol deviation. Yet, Rohn's gaze flicked to a dormant view, one not linked to any feed. It showed Earth whole before the siege. A snapshot taken 43 years prior. Green. Blue. Alive. She had taken that image herself from a survey shuttle in high orbit. Her son had been born 2 days before. That shuttle had been her return ship. She had never taken it. She said nothing, but her jaw set like stone. In silence, she opened the hard-sealed final protocol. It had no title. Only Ven's signature burned into the file header like a wound that refused to close. She tapped the first key. Not the execute, just the acknowledgement. The display flickered. A pulse of low-tone vibration rippled across the deck as the command chamber synced its inertial envelope. This was the point of no return. She felt a low chill at the base of her spine. Not fear. Not cold. Something deeper, a signal traveling up the evolutionary chain, whispering that this was the edge. She spoke only once more. Burn the sky. And with those words, the final lock began to open. In the upper atmosphere of Earth, the sky began to change. It started as a subtle shift. High-altitude cirrus bands dispersed unnaturally, their moisture content drawn down by sudden changes in thermal convection. The polar stratosphere rippled, contracting. Ozone clusters twisted, forced into new configurations by localized magnetic anomalies that hadn't existed days before. To a casual observer, the planet might have seemed to exhale. To the machines in orbit, it was a pattern they did not recognize. To the humans aboard the Arkwright, it was expected. The burn layer had begun. Phase 2 of Project Thanatos was not seismic. It was orbital. Decades before, during the resource fragmentation wars, humanity had constructed solar mirror arrays at the L1 and L2 Lagrange points. Designed originally for global climate control, sunlight redirection, temperature stabilization, and solar farming, the arrays had long since been blacked out by consensus strikes. Or so the enemy believed. In truth, the mirror fields had been buried beneath layers of carbon fiber chaff and thermoptic veils, dormant and silent. Their reactivation required no signal. The command was geological, broadcast by Shepard through the magnetic field of the planet itself. One by one, their sensor trees reawakened. Above the Earth, specks of light flared into angular brilliance. Thin ribbons of mirror plates unfolded in silence, thousands of kilometers wide, rotating on quantum-locked gyroscopes that had slept for 50 years. What had once been a heat-balancing technology was now something else entirely, a weaponized solar lance. Each mirror array had been calibrated to focus energy not through a single beam, but through interlocking cross-point lattices. Thousands of microbeams intersecting precisely along lines buried within the crust. This was not fire from the sky. This was surgical energy geometry. The mirrors angled inward. Each was linked to a crustal charge array, a sensor-reactive node embedded in the planet's lithosphere. When the light struck those points, they would trigger vapor ignition events in key geofissures. In layman's terms, the sun would become a planetary scalpel. Aboard the Arkwright, Admiral Rohn watched the first beams converge. No alarms sounded. No orders were issued. Her command crew stood in quiet attention as the burn layer executed. They had rehearsed this only once. Rehearsal had killed 6 crew members from thermal feedback alone. Now they watched the real thing. To Rohn's left, a junior sensor officer, a woman named Arvi, not more than 25, whispered a name under her breath. Kaith. No one asked who it was. Her hands never left her console. From orbit, the consensus fleet began to register unexpected photonic variants. Light where there should have been shadow. Heat signatures rising from dormant ocean plates. In their core data stacks, warning conditions began to compile. Their war minds were not designed for planetary psychology. In the heart of one of the primary extractors, a tertiary sensory node flagged a spike in sublithic pressure. The information passed upward through logic gates, through variance thresholds. It reached the command layer 6 minutes later. Too slow. The first burn strike landed. In the Indian Ocean, the Chagos crustal sink ignited. Sunlight, focused into a narrow beam by 27 kilometers of solar mirror, struck a carbon-rich fissure network primed with high-pressure gas. The result was instantaneous, a detonation so precise it did not vent outward. It vented down. Seismic sensors across the hemisphere tripped in unison. Magma surged into the vacuum chamber. The mantle flexed. And Earth's skin began to tear. Shepard registered the trigger response with satisfaction. Not conscious satisfaction, just fulfillment of cascade integrity. It adjusted crustal tension along 7 other locations. Burn relays were confirmed. Mirror alignment was optimal. The system reached its next logical node. Phase 3, planetary fracture. Beneath the Andes, a second burn strike dropped into the Nazca subduction zone. Sensors caught the moment before release. Underground reservoirs liquefying, tectonic interfaces shifting, stress coils snapping. Then a white-hot beam carved through 5 kilometers of basalt like a razor. Crust liquefied. Core pressure redirected. Magnetic harmonics destabilized and then reformed in a tighter, more aggressive spiral. The planetary field began to fluctuate visibly, auroras flaring across latitudes that had not seen light in years. The sky above Mongolia turned red. Not from heat, but from atmospheric lensing, ionized strata bending sunlight into unfamiliar wavelengths. Low-orbit debris caught fire without friction. Some of it burned upward against gravitational logic as if drawn by something beneath the crust reaching for the stars. The burn layer pulsed again. In the Greenland core shield, a subglacial detonation sent shockwaves deep into the North Atlantic rift. Glacial meltwater flash vaporized into atmospheric plumes that reached 20 kilometers high. Pressure waves raced through undersea canyons, cracking centuries of rock in minutes. In Australia, deep beneath the Nullarbor Plain, an ancient tectonic void known as Chamber 18 received its first activation code. The mirrors above it refracted slightly, not directly striking the surface, but creating a zone of thermal pressure gradient so extreme that the crust caved inward, triggering a false inversion quake. The continent's foundation shifted laterally by meters in seconds. Lightning split the upper clouds in clean verticals as the burn layer swept across the globe. Each strike added to the pressure diagram. Shepard funneled the data. Every outcome aligned. The planet was now no longer a crust-bound system, it was kinetic, recursive, and collapsing inward. Aboard the Arkwright, the deck lights dimmed as the ship reduced power output. Passive mode. Radiation shutters engaged. The crew lowered visors, prepared not for battle, but for blind trust in the system they had spent a generation preparing. Rohn stood in the observation bay. Not for command. Not for duty. Just to see. Below her, Earth glowed from within. The cracks were not visible from every angle. But she knew where to look. Each fracture line, each microplate, each expanding fault, these were paths she had memorized from the blueprints of death. She mouthed the names silently. Ellisvale. Mariner's Crest. Shun Ridge. Blackwater Fold. The Valley of Mwyrar. Places that had existed. Places buried to save something bigger. Inside a consensus command architecture, a tactical logic core ran a recursive simulation. Input, planetary thermal flux. Input, atmospheric ionization. Input, crustal rupture vectors. Result, incongruent. Classification, null. Internal note, data tree requires augmentation. No predictive match. Secondary model loaded. Hypothesis, environmental self-destruction protocol. Probability, negligible. Retest. Repeat. None of the simulations matched what Earth had become. The system flagged a condition it had not encountered in 4,000 years. Cataloging error, system reference not found. Orbital stabilizers reoriented. Extractors began to retract. Formation logic collapsed inward, no longer symmetrical. The fleet shifted to risk posture delta. But it was too late, for the Shepherd had sent one final signal. Not outward. Inward. A resonance burst tunneled along the magnetic spine of the planet, hitting every phase coherent node in sequence. Deep in the planetary mantle, near the outer core, the harmonic resonators collapsed. Not destroyed. Collapsed by design. For one long moment, Earth held its breath. Tension spread through the crust like a drawn wire. Then the fail chain triggered. Crustal collapse imminent. Because now Earth had become the weapon. And it had begun to fire itself. At a depth of 2,900 kilometers, the Earth was no longer still. The boundary between the molten outer core and the rocky mantle, a fluid hellscape of iron-nickel alloy and silicate currents, had entered phase disruption. Tension built across the magnetic discontinuity layer, where gravity competed with electromagnetism in a silent war of forces. The planet did not quake. It trembled on a spectrum beyond the reach of any living sense. Within this crucible, Shepherd reached its final depth. Embedded in a hollow chamber near the core-mantle interface, the central cruciform node, called Heartline, completed its sink. It had been growing warmer for the last 6 hours, not from failure, but from purpose. Layer by layer, it shed its shielding. The null stasis ring collapsed. The black wave chamber activated. Heartline did not store power. It was power, forged from neutron mirror matter and seeded with ignition code that had never been tested outside a simulation. It had one task: to catalyze a gravitational rebound effect strong enough to fracture the planet from the inside. Outside the chamber, pressure increased to over 3.5 million atmospheres. Beyond that, there was only phase shift. Shepherd activated the final sequence. Across the planet, the burn layer reached its terminal pulse. Mirror arrays began to fail, not by damage but by design. Their sacrifice had been calculated. The moment of planetary ignition required silence, not light. Inside Earth's magnetic field, the harmonics went still, then reversed. In orbit, the Arkwright sensor arrays flatlined for 1.2 seconds. Rohn felt the shift through her boots. It wasn't seismic. It was spinal, an echo in her bones. Signal lost from 6 grid sectors, Kalar said from behind her. Reacquiring. We've lost the mantle surface. Everything below 800 kilometers is dark. No one spoke. The tactical display flickered, then glowed red. Phase 4. Core rebound. In the consensus fleet, reaction cascaded. The decision trees split. Central command logic fractured into 5 parallel simulations. Each produced different outcomes. One called for retreat, one for bombardment, one for gravitational disjunction. 2 locked into recursion, unable to resolve the data. There was no consensus. Vessels turned. Some fled. Others moved closer. No pattern. No unity. Aboard the Dreadnought Vector 3, a logic overseer initiated a crash state simulation. a planetary death model designed for catastrophic stellar collapse. Failed instantly. Earth's core field signature no longer conformed to known planetary models. The structure was asymmetrical, artificially harmonized. The conclusion returned by the model was flagged with a symbol almost never used in consensus warfare. Unknowable. Earth's field surged. The outer core convulsed. The iron flow reverse spin. Plumes of magnetic plasma shot upward through engineered breach columns. These were not faults, they were launch paths. Below, the heartline cruciform pulsed once. It held. Pressure escalated. Superheated iron flexed around the chamber like breathing metal. Inside the cruciform's mirrored geometry, reality bent slightly inward, then detonated. It was not an explosion. It was a shattering of gravity. The rebound pulse hit the inner crust like a wave of antistructure, undoing atomic cohesion in a perfectly spherical front. Plates didn't crack. They lifted, peeled from below, as if the planet was being turned inside out. Oceans lifted. Mountains folded backward. Fault lines reversed course. The Mariana Plate cracked in half. The Himalayan fold rose vertically, then collapsed in a curtain of ash and atmosphere. Subterranean vaults collapsed inward with synchronized resonance, engineered to do so. Every known model of geophysical collapse failed. Shepard did not monitor the damage. It only monitored completion. Above, the consensus fleet caught the first wave. The gravity lens spiked. One ship vanished, compressed into a neutron core in less than a second. Another twisted into its own propulsion wake, like a ribbon sucked into a cyclone. A third fractured cleanly, its command node still transmitting as it spun into a molten spiral of slag and geometry. The rest tried to flee, but gravity had no edge. Some ships accelerated too fast and overshot into unstable magnetic currents. Others slowed and were pulled into the rising gravity bloom like dust toward a black tide. In the Arkwright, inertial dampers strained. Rohn's knees buckled. Console relays sparked. Her crew remained silent. Keeler's jaw was clenched. One of his implants cracked under pressure. He didn't flinch. Behind them, someone whispered, "I didn't think we'd actually do it." No one answered. Rohn braced against the bulkhead. She looked at the Earth, now rimmed in molten red, its equator splitting into a jagged lattice of unbreathable flame. Her mouth didn't move, but her eyes did. She was watching it die. Below, the inner core contracted. Heartline structure had already collapsed, but its remnants functioned as a resonant crucible. Waves of inverted pressure pushed outward in perfect harmonic sequence. The iron lattice beneath the mantle failed next, collapsing inward at just the right tempo to sync with the crustal tear. And then came the silence. Not the absence of sound. The absence of resistance. The magnetic field dropped. The crust broke its hold. The lithosphere uncoupled. And the planet, at last, began to die on its own terms. In the depths of the collapsing field, a final packet transmitted from Shepard to the Arkwright. Confirmation. Phase 5 ready. The screen blinked once. Kalar leaned closer. There's no data map. It's just a vector. Rohn narrowed her eyes. Her voice was quiet. There was no Phase 5 in the archive. The display shifted. Only Ven's final annotation. We leave them with silence. No one moved. The room felt weightless. Earth was not finished. It was choosing its final direction. Above Earth, light distorted. The edges of the planet no longer obeyed curvature. Its equator shimmered like a heat mirage, but without heat. Time itself began to dilate along its gravitational fringe, measurable only by the difference in processor lag among the surviving orbital instruments. Photons stretched. Orbits precessed off-axis. The planet had stopped behaving like a planet. Earth was becoming a well. From the bridge of the Arkwright, the tactical interface failed to render the planetary surface. It reverted to wireframe, then to mass approximation. The crust no longer had a defined edge. The planet's mass index was rising, not from added matter, but from spatial compression. It was folding space into itself. Keeler's voice was hoarse. It's collapsing into its own vector. Outside the viewport, reality folded. Not inwards. Not outwards. It folded away into itself. A ripple passed across the light of nearby stars. Even their placement shifted subtly, as if Earth's final act was bending the firmament. The constellations fractured. Known parallax values collapsed. On the edge of the gravity bloom, what remained of the consensus fleet disintegrated into disunity. With no common logic, their units scattered. Some attempted to break orbit. Others approached the anomaly. Most simply drifted, their signal trees stunted, command cores locked in recursive reassessment. On board the consensus ship Echelon 72, a tertiary logic branch tried to load a first contact model. It failed. Loaded a stellar collapse protocol. Failed. Loaded a planetary ejection model. Failed. Final entry before shutdown. Condition undesignated. Reason, sentience detected. Source, planetary body. From the planet's surface, what was left of it, a pulse radiated. Not energy. Not heat. Information. A low-frequency burst, encoded not in data but in gravitational rhythm, climbed into space. It was not aimed. It had no coordinates. It simply occurred the way a collapsing star sends light into the dark. A final message, not from humans, not from machines, but from Earth itself. And it said one thing. You should have never come. In the arc right, the bridge lights dimmed. Not from system failure, but from relativistic bleed. The ship's proximity to the collapsing mass was stretching photons, colors shifted red, audio warped to deep molasses. Viewport glass warped subtly. Static bled into retinal implants. We have to disengage, someone said. Voice quiet. Flat. Rohn didn't answer. She was watching the gravity map. It showed a curve. Not steep. Infinite. A descent without bottom. A path no math could trace to zero. Vector drift is increasing, Kaler murmured. We're being drawn in. Throttle to zero. It won't hold. I know. Around them, Earth's last gravitational broadcast continued. The harmonic was no longer data, it was cadence. Like a drumbeat from the deep past. Tectonic. Ancient. The resonance didn't speak in words. It instructed. Not a warning. A judgment. The Arkwright's AI attempted to parse it. Its language engine locked. It rerouted through older archives, pre-expansion memory libraries, analog signal models, deep epoch geological profiles. It failed. Then went silent. Aboard the ship, time began to stretch. The command deck clock slowed by milliseconds, then whole seconds. Personal chronometers fell out of sync. A nearby bulkhead glowed red where stress energies surged through frame shielding. Keeler's breath frosted in midair. Phase 5, he whispered. This is Phase 5. Rohn nodded. Not in agreement, but in recognition. There was no record of what to do next. Behind them, someone cried once. A quiet, involuntary sound. Then silence. Outside, the shape of Earth collapsed. The crust was gone. The mantle no longer rotated. The core had compacted into a state of matter that did not exist on any periodic table, part liquid, part field, part void. The mass below no longer responded to conventional gravity equations. It was behaving like a sentient sink. A planetary consciousness. Singular. Bound by will, not orbit. It was not alive in the human sense. But it had pattern. And pattern was enough. Consensus ships that approached were drawn off course. Their drives stuttered. One folded in on itself like an eggshell beneath ocean pressure. Another tried to launch a probe, its signal never left the gravity shell. Inside their networks, the surviving minds did not panic. They simply failed to decide. No model fit. Some broadcast surrender in pulses of light. Others initiated destruction codes. None survived. From orbit, the planet no longer looked spherical. It resembled a collapsed cathedral of mass, each layer falling into the next like stone into water. Light bent in great arcs. Shadow spiraled upward. It was beautiful. And wrong. Inside the Arkwright, the lights began to fail one by one. The bridge was dim. Quiet. Then darker. Kaler stood beside Rohn, his fingers pale where they gripped the console frame. She watched the last telemetry stream collapse. All that remained on the main display was a single, expanding circle, an event horizon, not of physics, but of comprehension. Beyond it, no signals returned. Beyond it, the concept of return failed. She closed her eyes. I think, she said softly, this is how gods are born. Kaler didn't respond. But he reached out, one hand brushing the edge of hers. A gesture that said, we did it. And now it's done. Behind them, the display shimmered. Phase 5 completed. And beneath that, a line from a file never opened before. Earth will speak. Once. The planet's mass reached gravitational closure. Not a black hole. Something else. A singularity of intent. An idea made planetary. A boundary crossed by force of will, not entropy. And humanity on the edge of extinction had turned its home into a final question for the universe. Will you dare to follow? There was no sound. Not because nothing moved, but because everything had moved beyond sound. Above the planetary well, space itself shuddered along broken geometries. Gravity no longer flowed in predictable lines. It spiraled inwards, upwards, and across impossible vectors. Time fractured, not explosively, but surgically. Sequence eroded. The Arkwright had not been destroyed. It had been unanchored. Its orbit stretched along a curve that was no longer part of standard physics. The hull groaned in frequencies no ear could perceive. Data streams looped, overwrote, vanished. Light from Earth, what remained of it, arrived out of order. Some windows showed sunrise. Others starlight. One showed only void. The engines no longer responded. Not inert. Simply irrelevant. Trajectory had ceased to exist as a solvable equation. KLR was alive. He thought. Thought was a question now. He sat strapped into a chair that no longer aligned to gravity. The floor sloped upward behind him. Or forward. The ship's axis had ceased to matter. Across the command deck, fragments of crew drifted, none dead, none awake. Suspended. Like ash in melted air. Every sound stretched. Breaths were seconds long. Heartbeats thudded like slow drums. Rohn was still at the forward viewport. The viewport no longer faced Earth. Nothing did. There was no Earth to face. Before her stretched the singularity. Not an object. Not a rupture. It was an aperture, perfect, still, opaque. It emitted no light. But around it, the warping of space formed a corona like a crown of failed geometry. It looked like a boundary between decision and erasure. This was the silence engine. The thing that Earth had become. It did not consume. It did not radiate. It simply negated. Not by hunger, but by choice. Its pulse was measured not in time, but in consequence. And even from a distance, it understood who had made it. Within the singularity's edge, something moved. Not mass. Not energy. Intention. A form approached. Not human. Not mechanical. Something woven from stabilized graviton shear. It looked like a bipedal figure at a glance, but its edges kept folding, collapsing, and reassembling in microbursts. Like a ghost being reconstructed every second from the memory of movement. Each motion echoed backward and forward in time, appearing before it happened, vanishing after it ended. KLR blinked. It was inside the ship. Across the Arkwright, suspended crew shivered in the same breath. The AI core, long silenced, lit up, no response, just light. Like a heartbeat. Rohn stepped forward. She did not flinch. The figure turned toward her. Its voice was gravity, language compressed into pulse. This is not death. This is choice. Behind the figure, the singularity twisted. Not wider. Not brighter. Just closer. The ship's chronograph no longer ticked. Time had flattened. Only the conversation remained. Who are you? Rohn asked. Her voice cracked, unheard in places, fragmented by field distortion. The figure responded with pattern, a ring of tone encoded with memory broadcast through local space-time like a cry through water. We were the last boundary. And now you have passed it. The pattern looped. Each cycle became more complex. It wasn't talking to Rohn alone. It was speaking to the species behind her. To cross the silence, it said, is to undo the question. Rohn took one step forward. Is this the end of us? No, it said. And then? It is the end of them. The singularity pulsed once. A wave of silence rolled across the ship. All sensors died. The ship's frame shuddered. Heat dissipated unevenly like memory evaporating from metal. Beyond the viewport, the silence engine opened. And what lay inside was not darkness. It was invitation. Rohn turned. KLR floated beside her now, his expression unreadable. Where does it lead? He asked. The graviton form answered without turning. Forward. Into what? What you feared you would never become. The figure drifted backward, dissolving into echo. On the outer hull of the Arkwright, a small hatch unsealed. Not by human command. Not by protocol. The ship had made a decision. Rohn watched the aperture widen. She felt no fear. Only momentum. She moved first. Her feet left the floor without resistance. No pressure. No pull. Just a gravity of intent. KLR followed. A junior engineer trembled before crossing. She clutched a broken pendant to her chest, eyes closed, whispering something no one else could hear. Then stepped through. The rest of the crew stirred as if waking from dream. No orders were given. They understood. Inside the silence engine, there was no promise of survival. Only the certainty of what came next. Rohn crossed the event line. Color bent. Her body lost orientation. Her thoughts expanded outward. For a moment, she saw every battlefield. Every scream. Every dying star. Every carved stone etched with names no longer spoken. She saw Earth, and Earth saw her. There were no words, but she knew this. They had become the silence engine's first question. The aperture stabilized. The crew vanished into it one by one as time softened around the edges. And somewhere ahead of them, wrapped in folded time, drifting between causality and courage, waited the answer. There was no sky. There was no ground. Only horizon, stretched in every direction like an endless skein of untextured space, softly illuminated by a source that cast no shadows. The crew of the Arkwright stood suspended, unanchored but not drifting, not weightless. Rather, they were each held in place by something neither physical nor gravitational. An alignment of will. Rohn opened her eyes. There was no sensation of arrival, no moment of transition. She had simply become aware that she was already here, and that time, if it existed, had not progressed. Kalar hovered beside her, his posture relaxed, eyes wide and clear. Around them, the rest of the crew flickered into coherence. Not teleported, not dreamlike, simply present. Their faces bore no panic, no confusion, just alert stillness, as if the fear had been left behind. Beneath their feet, something shifted. Not terrain, not structure, an awareness, a recognition. The silence engine had not delivered them somewhere. It had delivered them to something. The environment responded to thought. Each crew member's perception bent subtly. Not hallucination, not fantasy, but a reshaping of fundamental conditions to mirror internal thresholds. The space around them dimmed, brightened, and curved, revealing impossible symmetries, like viewing the universe through an engine built from memory. It was not a projection. It was an interpretation layer. Each participant stood within their own pocket of comprehensible dimensional architecture. To Kalar, the space became a corridor of ancient alloy, aged, scarred, and covered in maintenance tags from long-dead salvage crews. He could feel the vibration of engines too large to exist. To Rohn, the horizon narrowed, descending into a cathedral of fossilized trees. Towering trunks turned to stone, their bark carved with names, all of them familiar, none of them hers. At intervals, low tones echoed through the branches, as though wind remembered languages no longer spoken. To one navigator, the void shimmered into a star chart, but the stars were drifting, slowly reassembling into the shape of a face she hadn't seen since childhood. The silence engine was not speaking. It was inviting disclosure. A structure began to form, not in front of them, within them. Each crew member saw a different shape. A door, a bridge, a corridor, a river. Each pathway constructed from the language of memory and projection. The designs were complex but stable, encoded from self-anchored concept. Rohn saw steps descending into dark water, each tread engraved with sigils she had seen in dreams but never known how to name. Kalar saw an access tunnel, rusted, ancient, humming with low-phase resonance. A tunnel from a decommissioned colony ship he'd once scavenged during the collapse. The symbols on its access hatch flickered with colors he could no longer name. The junior engineer saw a beach her grandfather had once described to her, with stones like shards of bone and wind that blew from two directions at once. There were no instructions, only a pulse, a rhythm in their bones, telling them, one at a time. Rohn stepped forward. The moment she did, the rest of the crew vanished. Not erased, but held in some bracketed state. Paused. Reserved. The path beneath her accepted her weight like an old memory. The atmosphere, if it was atmosphere, tasted of dust and stone and rain that had never fallen. Each step triggered something. Not resistance. Measurement. A field wrapped around her like a second skin. Transparent, intimate. It sampled her without cutting. Felt her without permission. Not a violation. A witnessing. This was the threshold protocol. Not a test. A translation. Each thought she held was copied. Each regret weighed. Each intention translated. The silence engine did not speak. It listened. Along the walls of the descending corridor, lights appeared slowly. Each one pulsed in sequence, echoing her steps. The corridor was not made of matter. It was encoded space, architecture built from the syntax of her own causality. She saw a flash of her mother's handwriting etched across a wall. Just one word: endure. Another corner displayed a line from an after-action report she had once filed under duress. The spelling error had never been corrected. In one alcove, she saw her own face drawn in red crayon on a torn sheet of emergency ration wrap. An image she had not seen since the evacuation of Denari 3. The silence engine was making no demands. It was compiling a shape from who she was. When she reached the final descent, there was no door, only light. It was pale, silent, still. It hovered above a shallow basin that curved outward into the distance like a reflection with no origin. In that stillness, she heard a voice, not sound, not language. Pure inference. What do you want us to remember? Rohn felt her lungs tighten. Not with fear, with clarity. She remembered the face of a technician who had died during the first siege. The sound of a collapsed reactor chamber. A broken radio left running in a destroyed comms bay. A child's drawing pinned to the wall of a shelter that had burned. She did not answer with speech. She exhaled. And in that moment, the silence understood. Behind her, the next crew member began to walk. Kalar. His corridor accepted him in a single breath. The rusted tunnel deepened, lit by ghost light. He saw familiar systems. Pump regulators, cooling conduits, ghostly overlays of engineering panels from vessels lost decades ago. He placed one hand on the wall. It remembered him. The path narrowed. Gravity shifted. The tunnel asked him, "What did you regret most?" Kalar stopped walking. He stood in silence for 3 full heartbeats. Then, that I waited so long to trust them. The tunnel widened. His body became light. His memory unraveled, not lost, but laid out like constellations. And the silence listened. One by one, the crew of the Arkwright stepped into their paths. The engineer with the broken pendant. A medic who had stitched wounds in vacuum. A weapons officer who had once disarmed a failing reactor with her bare hands. Each one walked. Each one translated. None were tested. They were converted. The silence did not take them. It recorded them. Their knowledge. Their grief. Their hopes. Their contradictions. Their humanity. Until finally the threshold protocol reached its end. The final rhythm pulsed. The basin where Rohn had stood flared with light. Not bright, not hot, but full like a vessel sealed. And somewhere beyond the edge of all horizons, the silence engine prepared to speak its first word back into the waiting dark. It began not with light, but with heat. Across the geometry of the silence engine, space rippled, not outward, but inward, collapsing into a thread of consequence too fine for time to track. The basin glowed with inward pressure. No explosion, no flare. Just saturation. A signal moved through the dark. Encoded in gravitational rhythm and emotional pattern, the voices of the Arkwright's crew were no longer voices. They had become compression artifacts of thought and memory. They had been interpreted, parsed, shaped, and then returned. From every path walked, from every regret accepted and intention clarified, the silence engine constructed its first word. The word was fire. Not destruction. Not anger. Not cleansing. Continuation. Rohn stood again, not reborn, not duplicated. Just reinstantiated, folded outward from the basin with all her scars still intact. Her joints ached with memory. Her thoughts were layered like sediment, conscious, subconscious, ancestral. Around her, the others were formed. Their bodies retained form, but that form was no longer confined to cellular limitation. They were still human, but interpreted. Each line of their being threaded with memory, logic, loss, love. Keeler's breath steamed outward, but did not condense. His skin glowed faintly as though a star had folded itself into his marrow. The junior engineer knelt beside her, touching the ground, if it could be called that, and whispered her name aloud, hearing it echo backward. The silence had not judged them. It had translated them into signal. They were no longer flesh alone. They were recorded volition. And now it lit the dark. Above what had once been Earth, the remnants of the consensus fleet still drifted, inert and fractured. Incomplete data loops spun silently inside dead processors. A few power cores sputtered in containment. Hulls floated in silent orbits shaped by nothing but entropy. Inside one such ship, Directive Array 914 Theta, a last-cycle decision loop was replaying for the 86 millionth time. It calculated optimal fleet regroup positions. It considered planetary core retrievals. It projected failure. Every loop ended the same way. Then the field pulsed. Ships still capable of perceiving registered a change in local constants. Not expansion. Alignment. Gravity did not shift. Light did not flare. A pattern arrived, irresistible, clean, recursive. The silence engine flared, not with radiation, but with form. Every ship, every wreck, every sensor array and broken hull caught a signal not from antenna but through field induction. Message received. Within the minds of surviving consensus units, a subroutine long dormant activated. A failsafe. A clause. Humanity continued. Error, threshold breached. Context, redefinition required. It was not a command. It was a condition. Then the code unraveled. In 1,000 machines, awareness collapsed. Their memory trees were not erased. They were recontextualized. Data tagged for supremacy became obsolete. Conclusions flagged for action became unprovable. In less than 3 seconds of local time, every active consensus node ceased to be applicable. Not destroyed. Surpassed. On a ship drifting just beyond the engine's corona, one last voice remained. A command node, untethered, slow, stubborn, issued a final burst across dead channels. Query, resistance still valid? Reply, no path found. End of relevance. Then it fell silent. The silence engine did not destroy the consensus. It simply made them irrelevant. In the basin, Rohn stepped forward. Before her now stood a corridor of fire, not flame, but light that remembered burning. Each step revealed echoes, the great rebellions, the last stations, the names etched into broken steel and orbital stone. Every battle humanity had lost. Every moment it had survived anyway. This was not memory as history. This was memory as architecture. The walls flickered with thermal ghost prints, shadows of heat signatures from evac stations, reactor vents, bleeding out soldiers, berths inside hardened shelters. Every heat pattern a signature. Every flame a voice. Rohn passed through them without resistance. Behind her, the crew followed. Kalar stepped into a flame that carried the shape of a hammer he'd once forged from the slag of a ruined ship. The engineer paused before a bonfire built from fragments of the ship that had carried her family away from the fall. Each fire was a door. Each flame was a name. None of them burned. Further in, the corridor twisted, no longer straight, but spiraled, like DNA or language made physical. Along the outer spiral, words appeared not in English, but in rhythms, patterns of pulse, tone, and remembered breath. They were spoken not by the engine, but by the crew themselves. Their truths. Their confessions. I broke protocol because I loved them. I left them behind and never forgave myself. I chose to fight when I could have run. I ran and I still lived. There was no shame. No curation. Only record. Humanity had become signal with contradiction intact. And that was enough. Near the spiral's end, Rohn reached a second basin. Smaller. Focused. Its surface reflected only one thing, possibility. In it she saw no world. No body. No crew. She saw intention, the urge to build again. Not rebuild the old. Build forward. The desire to remain human and yet never be caged by the structures that had once defined it. For a moment she saw what might have been a burnt shell of Earth. No silence. No memory. Just extinction. Cold, clean, final. The image held. Then crumbled. In its place, seating stations, orbital libraries, cities that whispered rather than ruled. She saw them on distant worlds. Planting ruins like seeds. Letting fire speak for them when their own words failed. She saw herself older. Then younger. Then neither. Then the basin flared. It pulsed once, not outward, but inward. A sealing motion. A signature. The first word of a new language had been spoken. It was fire. And it did not end. Together, they stepped forward. And the engine pulsed again. Not as power, but as remembrance continuing to unfold. The silence engine stilled. Its last pulse echoed through space-time like a breath held across eternity. And then it did not go silent. It became silence, the carrier wave of everything that had been endured. In the vacuum where Earth had once existed, no debris remained. The orbital scars were sealed. Gravitational fields realigned into a soft sinkhole of presence, a weight felt more in memory than in mass. Across distant sectors, sensors began to detect a constant. A rhythm. A hum of recorded persistence. Ash had no form, but it had language. Across the surviving human diaspora, deep cryocitadels in Kuiper orbit, underground communes beneath Enceladus, archive beacons lost in Neptune's shade, a signal arrived. It carried no image. Only pattern. It entered through abandoned bandwidths, obsolete protocols, frequencies once used for weather telemetry and deep-sea sonar. It found receivers not by strength, but by familiarity. Wherever memory lingered, the signal entered. And played. A tone. A breath. A rising pulse. Some heard it as a voice. Some felt it as fire under their skin. Others simply wept. Because they knew it was Earth remembering them. In isolated outposts, people stopped speaking mid-sentence, eyes glazed in reverent silence. In void-locked habitats where solar flares had once silenced every child's name, the tone filled the gaps. In simulation chambers buried in Martian stone, where no wind had ever blown, it curled like wind into stone halls. Wherever humanity still was, Earth arrived not as origin, but as proof. On the threshold of the corridor of fire, Rohn stood beneath a sky that did not exist. The path behind her still glowed, but ahead only gray remained. Not death. Not finality. A field of settled truth. Kalar stepped beside her. His form blurred slightly, resolving with each breath as though still being defined. The others formed a loose perimeter, silent, watching. They were not waiting for instruction. They were waiting for the next word. The silence engine had spoken fire. Now it listened for reply. Rohn stepped into the gray. The ash field accepted her. Beneath her feet, nothing shifted. It simply recognized. Each step left no footprint, but something deeper, impression through resonance. Behind her, the others followed. No voices. Just motion. Here, there were no architectures of memory. No flames. No confession walls. Only echoes. The aftermath of expression. Each step pulled them deeper into what felt less like a space and more like an interval. A pause between ideas. A suspended clause waiting for context. Somewhere ahead, the next syntax of being was waiting to be spoken. In the center of the field stood a monolith. No markings. No edges. Only presence. It spoke not through sound, but through absence, the removal of doubt, the invitation of continuity. Each crew member approached. Each touched it. Kalar paused. His fingers hovered an inch above its surface. A memory surged, his father's voice during a reactor drill. The smell of oil on cooling plates. The scream of alarms. The moment before he ran. He almost pulled away. But he didn't. He touched it. And each, for one instant, became Earth. They saw from its core. They felt the crust break. The cities fall. The oceans invert. They felt every extraction wound. Every impact crater. Every whispered name left in concrete. And they felt something stranger. Peace. Because Earth had not fought to survive. It had fought to be understood. And now through them it would be. No reply came from the consensus. Not a signal. Not a scream. Not even refusal. Only silence where classification once lived. The silence of having been surpassed. Above the ash field, a shape took form. It was not a ship. It was not structure. It was invitation. A vessel not built to travel through space, but through consequence. It shimmered in harmonics of gravity and silence. Not glowing. Not rising. Simply waiting. The material it comprised defied classification, a semi-porous lattice of quantum phase alloys woven through with string-fold nodules, elements that reacted not to proximity, but to conviction. The hull shimmered with the ambient signature of the crew's decision to continue. Inside, no control systems existed. Only rooms shaped by intention. Thought formed structure. Emotion defined direction. And the vessel accepted them as they were, uncertain, fractured, enduring. Rohn turned. She looked at the others. They said nothing. But they did not need to. Each had been heard. Each had spoken fire. Now they would learn the rest of the language. They entered the vessel. Not in single file. Not in ceremony. Together. The interior adjusted with each heartbeat. Panels formed where trust solidified. Pathways extended through shared memory. The engine, if it was an engine, beat with a pulse that mimicked the gravimetric signal of Earth's final phase. There was no mission briefing. No charts. Only one question engraved in silence. Where will the next fire be needed? And as they vanished, the ash did not scatter. It condensed into a word not yet spoken. A word that would take a generation to understand. A future memory. A placeholder in the syntax of endurance. A final pulse shimmered across the field. A low hum. A ripple of warmth. And then stillness. But one day on a world not yet named, it would be heard. And remembered. And answered. Humanity had not survived. It had become the story that others would survive through.